I caught a shrieking woman in my backyard, her skin stained a shocking electric blue as she clawed her way out of my pool. She had trespassed, and now the entire neighborhood would witness the shocking truth I'd hidden beneath the surface. If you want more jaw-dropping stories like this, smash that like button and subscribe for weekly madness. Summer in the suburbs is a delicate thing. It teeters on the edge of serene and chaotic, where perfectly trimmed lawns hide quiet rivalries and picket fences feel more like whitewashed battle lines. I had lived on Oak Grove Lane for 4 years by the time that particular July rolled around, and I had come to appreciate the strange etiquette of the neighborhood. It was an unspoken contract of civility. We waved, we nodded, we smiled over hedges, and then we retreated behind our doors and locked the world out. Everyone kept to themselves, and for a while, it worked. Then I installed the pool. It wasn't flashy. No gaudy lights, no oversized waterfall feature. Just a modest in-ground rectangle with clean lines and slate trim, tucked neatly into the backyard and hidden from the street by a privacy fence and a row of thick arborvitae. To me, it was more about practicality than luxury. Summers here could reach melting point, and I wanted a place to cool off. Maybe I also liked the idea of inviting a few friends over now and then, grilling burgers, blasting some music not loud enough to cause complaints, of course, and relaxing in peace. But peace didn't last long. The moment construction began, I felt the shift. It started with glances from neighbors that lasted just a beat too long. Conversations dropped in volume as I passed. A man I barely knew named Howard, who lived 2 houses down, stopped walking his dog along my side of the street. At first, I brushed it off as paranoia, the kind that creeps in when you suddenly become the focus of neighborhood attention, but it became impossible to ignore. The real problem, though, wasn't the whispers. It wasn't even the passive-aggressive comments I started getting about property values and water runoff. No, the real problem had a name. Karen. I don't know when she started watching me exactly. Maybe it was during the first week of construction, when the backhoe arrived. Maybe it was the moment I signed the contract, and she got wind of it through whatever subterranean gossip pipeline fed her need to know every detail about every person on the block. But once her attention locked onto me, it never let go. Karen was the unofficial queen of Oak Grove Lane, and she held court with the intensity of someone who believed the fate of civilization hinged on symmetrical mailbox placement. She had a way of inserting herself into things that weren't hers. She didn't knock so much as announce her presence with a kind of authority that dared you to argue. She once scolded a delivery driver for parking on the street too long. She petitioned the Homeowners Association to ban inflatable holiday decorations. She circulated a flyer asking us to turn off porch lights by 9:30 to preserve nocturnal harmony, whatever that meant. So it came as no surprise when she cornered me in my driveway one afternoon, arms folded, lips pursed, hair in a tight, unyielding bun. "You know," she said, her voice syrupy and sharp, "chlorine can really disturb the local wildlife." I had just come back from the hardware store, arms full of supplies. I blinked at her. "Excuse me?" "The birds," she said, as if explaining something to a child. "They rely on consistency. Pools change the humidity, the scent patterns. You're disrupting their ecosystem." I had no response for that. Not a good one, anyway. I just nodded and carried my buckets inside while she watched, no doubt filing away my reaction for later analysis. After that, her visits became more frequent. Sometimes she didn't even pretend to have a reason. I'd catch her peeking through the slats of the fence, pretending to walk her dog. Other times, she would stand near her mailbox with a cup of coffee, eyes fixed on my yard. She would comment on the construction trucks, then on the shape of the deck, then on the landscaping. It was relentless. Still, I tried to keep things civil. I had lived in apartment buildings before, shared walls with screamers and floorboards with insomniac tappers. I knew the value of a quiet neighbor, and I wanted to be one. So I smiled and nodded and kept my comments to myself. I figured once the pool was finished and the novelty wore off, she'd move on. I underestimated her capacity for obsession. The week the pool was filled and operational, I began to notice strange things. At first it was subtle. A damp towel on the patio that I hadn't used, footprints in the dirt around the filter unit, a plastic cup bobbing in the shallow end, even though I hadn't had guests over in days. I checked the camera feed from my security system, but it was motion-activated and spotty. Nothing concrete, just shadows and the occasional flicker of movement. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe I was getting paranoid too. Then I found the shoe. It was wedged behind the pool house door, partially hidden by a rake. A women's sandal, white with rhinestones. I turned it over in my hands, my stomach twisting. It didn't belong to anyone I knew. I didn't even have female friends in the area, much less anyone who would randomly stop by and go for a swim without asking. That was the tipping point. I didn't call the police. That felt extreme. But I did call my cousin Marcus, who works in private security. He owed me a favor, and he offered a solution I hadn't considered: an experimental pool treatment. It was legal, non-toxic, originally designed for resort properties that dealt with frequent, unauthorized use. The solution activated on contact, bonding temporarily to skin proteins and dyeing them a vivid blue color visible for several days. He promised it was completely harmless, just dramatic, just enough to make a point. I agreed. The application process took less than an hour, and I did it late at night, under the glow of my porch lights. I watched the faint shimmer settle over the water. It looked no different. It smelled no different. But now, it carried a message. One that wouldn't be visible until someone crossed the line. By the next morning, everything seemed normal. Birds chirped, sprinklers hissed on. Karen was nowhere in sight. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat by the window, waiting for the first sign. A ripple, a shadow, a mistake. Someone was going to learn a lesson, and when they did, it would be permanent. Karen had not always been the central figure of neighborhood drama. When I first moved in, she was just another face in the patchwork of trimmed hedges and identical garages. She waved, same as everyone else. She brought over a plate of oatmeal cookies during my first week, which struck me as suspiciously generous in a community that seemed allergic to unsolicited kindness. I did not eat them. Something about the way she hovered by the door, watching my reaction a little too closely, felt performative, as though she were logging points in a mental ledger. Still, I thanked her and smiled, and she left with an air of satisfaction. It was only after a few months that her true nature began to surface. She didn't like change. More precisely, she didn't like change she could not control. When the neighbors on the corner painted their shutters pale blue, she campaigned door to door with a stack of printed surveys, asking whether the color offended traditional tastes. When a college student moved into a rental 2 doors down, she took it upon herself to introduce him to the neighborhood code of conduct, a document she had typed and laminated herself. No loud music, no cars in the driveway after 10, no porch lights left on all night. She always insisted these were unwritten rules, passed down through decades of quiet understanding, but there was never any evidence that anyone else believed in them. Somehow, she had appointed herself the guardian of our collective peace, and any violation, however small, was taken as a personal affront. She carried herself like a diplomat and a drill sergeant at once, flitting between fake concern and sharpened scolding in the span of a sentence. Her favorite tactic was phrasing everything as a question, but one you were clearly meant to answer in the way she expected. Are you planning to move that car? Is that grass supposed to be that long? Are you aware your wind chimes can be heard from across the street? It was exhausting. Most people learned to smile and give her what she wanted, or at least make it look like they had. I tried to do the same, but she always seemed to sense resistance. She would linger near my mailbox when I came home from work, pretending to adjust her gardenia bushes while tracking my every move. She timed her trash runs to coincide with my morning coffee trips to the curb. She had questions, always questions, and I learned quickly that she didn't ask them to be answered. She asked them to assert control. When the pool construction began, her curiosity bloomed into something more intense. She asked about permits. She wanted to know if I had considered drainage flow. She expressed concern that standing water might attract mosquitoes. I told her, politely at first, that everything was being handled by licensed professionals. That answer only encouraged her. She began taking pictures from her front lawn. She made remarks within earshot of the workers. She even called the city once, though they found no violations. That would have been enough to place her firmly in the camp of neighborhood nuisances. But what elevated her to something more dangerous was how quickly she could shift tones. She had a talent for playing the victim, for rerouting blame even as she peddled aggression. One minute she was accusing me of endangering the community with improper filtration. The next she was tearfully explaining to a neighbor that she only wanted everyone to be safe. It was hard to argue with her without looking like the villain. That was her gift. She stoked conflict and wore innocence like armor. I learned, through quiet observation, that she was lonely. Her husband, if he existed, was never seen. No children visited. Her dog, a twitchy Yorkie named Captain, was the only living being she seemed to show consistent affection for. She walked him 6 times a day and spoke to him as though he were her co-conspirator. I once overheard her say, "We have to be strong, Captain. Some people don't care about order," and I couldn't tell if she meant it as a joke. Still, I tried to keep my distance. I nodded when we passed. I kept the music low. I planted hedges tall enough to block her line of sight, but there was only so much I could do. The week after I applied the blue dye to the pool, her behavior escalated. I would catch glimpses of her standing just outside the fence line, arms folded, Captain quivering in her grasp. Once, I found the gate unlatched, not wide open, just enough to make me wonder. I began to suspect she had been waiting for an opportunity, a moment when the yard was unguarded and curiosity could slip into action. I imagined her, creeping along the side of the house, peering through the slats, daring herself closer with every visit. She made her move the following Thursday. I didn't see it happen. That was the thing. Whatever else Karen was, she wasn't stupid. She waited until I had left for groceries. She knew my habits. I realized later that I had underestimated how closely she had been watching. She must have noted my departure time down to the minute. Must have waited. Captain probably left at home, leash coiled on the counter. Must have tiptoed into the yard with her sandals in hand, and her righteous indignation pumping like adrenaline in her veins. And then she jumped. I try not to think too much about what went through her mind in those moments. Whether she felt triumph or vengeance or simply curiosity, overtaking her better judgment, whether the water was warm, whether it stung when the dye met her skin, whether she realized instantly that she had made a terrible mistake, or only when she saw her reflection rippling in blue. What I do know is that I returned home 30 minutes later to the sound of furious yelling echoing across the cul-de-sac. I parked, groceries forgotten in the trunk, and followed the noise with a creeping sense of dread. It led me to her front yard, where a cluster of neighbors had gathered like spectators at a roadside fire. And there she was. Karen. Blue. Her skin was covered in splotches of vivid, unmistakable color. It coated her arms, her neck, even her face. Her once pristine white tennis outfit now looked like a rejected art project. She was pacing in furious circles, phone in hand, gesturing wildly as she screamed into the receiver. Her voice carried, shrill and enraged, punctuated by gasps for air. She spotted me immediately and pointed with an accusatory finger. You did this to me." Every eye turned. I said nothing. What could I say? The dye had worked. It had done exactly what it was designed to do. Karen had trespassed, and now she had been marked. I should have felt satisfied. I should have relished the moment, the justice of it. But watching her there, humiliated and furious, I felt something colder take root. This wasn't the end. Not for her. Not for me. This was only the beginning. The night before it happened, everything was still. The kind of stillness that makes you feel like the whole street has gone into hibernation, like the universe is holding its breath. The air was heavy with summer heat, and even the crickets seemed too exhausted to chirp. I had left the back patio light on and was half listening for the soft click of the motion sensors while scrolling through my phone on the couch. There was nothing out of the ordinary, nothing to indicate that the boundary between ordinary and absurd was about to shatter. I had started reviewing the footage every night around that time, partly out of caution, partly because of the growing suspicion that someone had been testing the fence. Maybe not climbing it, maybe not even touching it, but loitering just close enough to trigger the weaker perimeter pings that registered only as faint disturbances in the software. The alerts were irregular, harmless on their own. A flash of wind, the occasional rabbit perhaps, but something about the frequency felt deliberate. Like someone was pacing just out of view, mapping the lines in their head. That night, the first ping came just after 11:30, a sharp tone that cut through the hum of the air conditioner and sent a jolt through my chest. I dropped my phone and sat up, the glow from the living room casting long shadows on the wall behind me. The monitor by the back window lit up in response to the alert, flickering briefly before settling on a grainy feed from the northeast corner of the yard. At first, there was nothing, just the pool, calm and dark, reflecting the yellow of the porch light. The breeze stirred the hedges gently. A moth fluttered across the lens. Then something shifted. A shape. Not large, not immediately distinguishable, but present. It darted across the frame in a quick blur, followed by a soft splash so faint I might have missed it if I hadn't been straining to hear. I stared at the monitor, rewound the clip, played it again. The shape was bipedal, definitely human. No question. The splash had not been the sound of something being thrown in or falling by accident. It was purposeful. The pool water rippled outward in soft concentric circles that suggested entry rather than impact. I stood frozen for several seconds, trying to process what I had just seen. It wasn't fear that struck me first. It was something closer to disbelief. Despite everything, despite the footprints, the gate, the shoe, part of me still hadn't truly believed someone would go that far. Not even Karen. I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer and stepped onto the patio, careful to keep my footsteps quiet. The air outside was thick with humidity, clinging to my skin like a wet cloth. The fence loomed ahead, its wooden boards tall and unyielding, the gap where it met the pool deck just wide enough for someone determined to squeeze through. I approached slowly, heart pounding, listening for any sign of movement. For a moment I thought I heard splashing again, but it stopped too quickly. I reached the edge of the pool and scanned the surface. Nothing. The water was still. Too still. I walked the perimeter once, checking for footprints, but found only damp boards and a faint smell of something sweet, like coconut lotion. My light caught something near the deep end, just beneath the surface. I leaned over, squinting. A strand of blonde hair floated near the drain, long, untied. It drifted like seaweed, then vanished into the suction of the skimmer. There was no one in sight, no sign of forced entry. I backed away slowly, skin prickling, and returned to the house. I didn't sleep that night. I watched the footage again and again, zooming in, adjusting the contrast, trying to get a clearer view. Each time, the same thing. A blur, a splash, ripples, then nothing. By morning, the neighborhood felt different. The usual sounds of sprinklers and lawnmowers were absent. People moved slower, conversations muted. I stepped outside with my coffee and was halfway down the driveway when I heard the shouting. At first, I thought it was a child, the high-pitched shriek of someone upset about a lost toy or a stubbed toe. But the tone was all wrong. The panic in it wasn't performative or fleeting. It was raw, like an animal howl trying to escape the confines of human words. I followed the sound around the corner and stopped dead in my tracks. Karen stood in the middle of her front yard, soaked from head to toe, her skin stained a vibrant, unmistakable blue, not pale, not tinted, fully and deeply colored, like someone had dipped her in ink. Her hair clung to her face in tangled wet ropes, and her arms flailed wildly as she screamed into the sky, into her phone, into the bewildered faces of the neighbors who had gathered to watch. "This is an attack," she was yelling. "I've been assaulted. This is chemical warfare. Call the police. Call the homeowners association. Call someone." She looked completely unhinged. Blue rivulets ran down her legs and pooled around her bare feet. Her white tennis dress, now clinging and translucent, only made the spectacle more surreal. Her eyes locked on mine with the intensity of a predator who had finally found its prey. "You did this," she screamed, pointing a dripping finger. "You poisoned your pool and set me up. I'll have you arrested. You think this is funny?" No one said a word. The neighbors stood in stunned silence, expressions ranging from concern to stifled laughter to mild horror. One man, the type who always wore socks with sandals, raised his phone to take a photo, then thought better of it and slowly lowered his hand. I walked up to the edge of her lawn and stopped, hands raised slightly in a neutral gesture. "Karen," I said, keeping my voice calm, "you were in my backyard. You entered my property. The pool has a deterrent system. It's safe, but it stains skin for several days to discourage trespassing." She blinked. The rage didn't fade, but I saw it flicker, just for a second, replaced by confusion. She wasn't expecting logic. She wasn't prepared for a rational explanation. "You set a trap," she hissed. "I secured my home. I replied. Someone in the crowd let out a quiet chuckle. Karen turned toward the sound like a hawk spotting movement in the grass, but it was too late. The tension had already shifted. The spectacle was no longer frightening. It was absurd. She had lost control of the narrative. I turned and walked back toward my house. I knew this wasn't over. Karen wasn't the type to let something like this fade. She would regroup. She would retaliate. But as I closed the door behind me and sat down at my computer to upload the footage, I felt a rare satisfaction. Let her yell. Let her spin her stories. The truth was recorded, time-stamped, and ready to go viral. I pressed play and watched the screen come to life. A blurry figure, a splash, a few seconds of silence, and then, rippling across the water like paint across a canvas, the unmistakable hue of justice. The pool had spoken. By the time the sun had fully risen, Karen had disappeared from her front lawn. One of the neighbors later said she had stormed back into her house in a frenzy, slamming the door so hard that a decorative wreath fell to the ground and rolled into the street. Captain, her tiny Yorkie, barked for nearly 15 minutes from behind the curtains before silence settled again over Oak Grove Lane. But the silence did not last. What followed was a day of murmurs and messages, of knowing glances exchanged behind drawn blinds. I noticed more people than usual outside, slowly sweeping their driveways, pretending to water their lawns, each one angling for a better view of Karen's house. She kept her blinds tightly shut, but everyone knew what had happened. The image of her, dripping wet and glowing blue, had seared itself into the collective memory of the neighborhood. For a place that typically thrived on passive observations and whispered updates, this was a seismic event. I spent the early part of the morning reviewing the footage again. This time, it was less about understanding what had happened, and more about preparing to make sure everyone else understood it too. The cameras had captured everything: her creeping along the side yard, peeking through the gate, hesitating only briefly before slipping through the narrow opening and lowering herself into the pool. The water, undisturbed for only a moment, shimmered as she moved through it. And then, slowly, the color began to rise across her body. It was not instantaneous. It bloomed like smoke beneath the surface, wrapping around her arms, her legs, her back. She stood in the shallow end for a minute, looking around, unaware that the change had begun. It wasn't until she saw her hands, stained with blue, that she panicked and stumbled backward, slipping and flailing her way out of the pool like a wounded animal. I debated whether to blur her face. Part of me wanted to be merciful, but then I remembered the weeks of veiled threats, of unwanted confrontations and whispered insinuations. I remembered the way she had marched across my lawn with a sense of ownership that was never hers. I remembered the false report she filed with the HOA claiming I had installed illegal lighting. No, her face stayed. The video was only 2.5 minutes long, but it told the entire story. I added a short caption: "When the neighborhood enforcer breaks her own rules." Then I hit upload. The response was immediate. Within the first hour, it hit 1,000 views. Comments poured in, a mix of disbelief, hilarity, and a certain vicious glee. By lunchtime, the video had crossed the 50,000 mark, and people began tagging their friends, sharing it on other platforms, stitching reaction videos, and asking for context. The title I had given it did most of the heavy lifting, but once the footage began circulating, the content sold itself. Karen, or Blue Karen, as the internet quickly named her, had become a symbol, not just of neighborhood entitlement, but of consequences. The fact that the dye was harmless only made it more poetic. It wasn't injury. It wasn't violence. It was visual justice, loud and undeniable, a mark of exposure. I had mixed feelings watching it unfold. The views were addicting. The comments were thrilling. But beneath the rush was a nervous energy I could not shake. I knew her. I knew how she operated. She would not sit quietly while the world laughed at her. I half expected her to appear at my door again, this time with fists clenched and accusations flying. But she didn't. Instead, she made a call. The first official message I received came from the local police department. A polite voicemail requesting a statement regarding an alleged incident of property endangerment. I returned the call and was connected with a tired-sounding officer who assured me it was standard procedure. Karen had filed a complaint. She claimed I had booby-trapped my pool with a dangerous chemical. I explained the purpose of the dye, that it was non-toxic and designed solely as a deterrent. I even offered to provide documentation and a sample if necessary. The officer paused for a long moment, then exhaled slowly and said, "Honestly, it sounds like she's just mad she got caught." Still, they sent someone out later that day to take a statement and have a quick look at the setup. A young officer in mirrored sunglasses arrived around 3. He took notes, recorded the details, and asked if I'd mind showing him the footage. We watched it together, and when it ended, he chuckled and shook his head. "She walked right into it," he said, scribbling something in his notebook. "Not much we can do about embarrassment." He left after reassuring me that no charges would be filed against me unless new evidence emerged. That part lingered in my mind. Karen would not stop at a single report. That was not her style. By early evening, I started receiving messages from unfamiliar accounts. Strangers congratulating me. Journalists requesting interviews. People asking for advice on how to rig their own pools with similar security measures. A few offers came from media outlets with enough credibility to make me pause. One wanted to license the footage for a weekend news segment. Another asked if I would write a guest article about the suburban surveillance revolution. I ignored most of it. I wasn't interested in becoming a full-time commentator on neighbor relations. Still, it was strange to walk through my own house, passing windows where I knew cameras captured every angle, and realize that what had once been a simple security precaution had turned into a public exhibit. Every moment was now a potential clip. Every interaction, a possible episode. As night fell, I sat on the back deck and watched the pool, which looked exactly the same as it always had. Clear, calm, silent, but it had become something else entirely. It was no longer just water. It was a line, a test, a question, with a visible answer. Across the street, I saw movement behind Karen's curtain. A brief flutter, then stillness. She was there, watching. I could feel it. Somewhere inside her house, she was crafting her next move. Maybe she was writing a letter to the HOA. Maybe she was consulting a lawyer. Maybe she was just sitting in the dark, staring at her hands, still faintly blue, wondering how it had all slipped so quickly out of her control. But I knew one thing for sure. This was far from over. The morning after the video exploded, I woke up to the sound of my phone vibrating on the nightstand like a trapped insect. It was 6:15, and I had barely managed a few hours of restless sleep, but the screen was already flooded with notifications. Comments, shares, reposts, tags. My inbox was full of messages from people I did not know, and several missed calls blinked at me like silent warnings. One of the messages was from a verified news account, asking if I was available for an interview. Another came from someone who claimed to represent a popular morning show. There were dozens more, mostly from random users who had seen the video and wanted to tell me how hilarious it was or how much they admired my creativity. Some asked for technical specs on the dye. Others asked where to buy it. One particularly enthusiastic message called me a hero and included a meme of Karen photoshopped into the poster for the movie Avatar. I stumbled into the kitchen, started the coffee machine, and watched the notification counter on my phone rise in real time. The video had crossed over 3 million views. Someone had edited it to include dramatic music and subtitles. Someone else had turned it into a song, a bizarre auto-tuned anthem that repeated the phrase, "Blue Karen got caught," over a pulsing beat. The internet was chewing it up and turning it into something bigger than me. I opened the curtains and looked out onto the street. A delivery truck was parked across from Karen's house. The driver leaned against the side of the vehicle, phone in hand, aiming the camera at her windows. When he saw me looking, he smiled and gave a sheepish wave before climbing back into his truck. I watched him drive off and realized the world had started to arrive at my doorstep. Karen's blinds were still closed, but I could feel the pressure building from within. She had not emerged since the incident. Her lawn was beginning to show signs of neglect, with edges curling toward the sidewalk and leaves accumulating near the hedges. Captain had not been seen either. The silence from her house was both unsettling and theatrical, as though she were preparing for a grand return. I spent most of the day indoors, alternating between fascination and dread as the numbers climbed higher. The comments grew more intense. People were now speculating about Karen's life, her history, her motivations. Some claimed to know her. One user posted what they insisted was a yearbook photo from her high school. Another swore she had tried to write them a ticket for leaving their recycling bin out too long when they lived in a different neighborhood. Whether true or not, the stories multiplied. The hashtag spread. Blue Karen, Karen Pool Saga, caught blue-handed. The video had turned into a phenomenon, and with it came an undercurrent of chaos I could not fully control. I had started this with a single clip and a title meant to make people laugh. I had not expected it to snowball into a cultural moment. By mid-afternoon, a local reporter showed up at my door. She was polite and professional, young, with a notepad in hand and a cameraman trailing behind her. She asked for a quick statement, maybe a tour of the backyard. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to keep my head down, let the storm pass. But another part recognized the value in getting ahead of the narrative. Better that I shape it than let it be twisted by speculation. I agreed, as long as they kept the visit short. I showed them the pool, explained the dye, described the series of events without embellishment. The reporter nodded, scribbled, and occasionally looked up with the expression of someone struggling to hide amusement. Before they left, she asked if I had any regrets. I thought for a moment and said no. She smiled and thanked me. The segment aired later that night, just after the weather report. It was clean, to the point, and surprisingly generous. They ran the footage again, this time with commentary and a light-hearted tone that framed it as a lesson in boundaries. Karen's name was not mentioned, but anyone familiar with the street or the original video already knew. The aftermath arrived the next morning. Another video surfaced, this one taken from someone across the street, showing Karen in her front yard during the initial outburst. It had better sound than mine. Her words were clearer, her rage more vivid. That version went viral too. With it came more attention and more cruelty. Someone painted a mailbox blue and left it at the edge of her driveway. A package arrived at her doorstep covered in blue glitter and labeled, "For your complexion." Kids on bikes rode past her house yelling slogans from the meme song. The internet had turned on her completely. I began to feel uneasy. This had stopped being funny somewhere along the way. The dye was temporary. The video was brief. But the reaction had become something darker. It was not just amusement anymore. It was punishment. And while Karen had brought much of this on herself, I could not help but wonder where the line was between justice and spectacle. I did not have to wonder for long. Karen returned to the world 3 days later, stepping outside just as the mail arrived. She wore a large sun hat, oversized sunglasses, and long sleeves, but the blue hue still stained her hands and ankles. She walked stiffly to the mailbox, retrieved a stack of envelopes, and turned to find a group of neighbors watching from across the street. No one spoke. She paused, clutched the mail tighter, and then straightened her posture. "You think this is over," she said loudly as if addressing a jury. "But I'm not going anywhere. This neighborhood deserves better. It deserves order, and I will not be silenced." With that, she turned and walked back inside, slamming the door behind her. An hour later, a new account appeared on social media using her house number as its handle. It posted a statement claiming the pool dye was illegal, that she had been harmed, that she was planning legal action. It also accused me of slander, harassment, and reckless endangerment. The account posted screenshots of outdated pool safety guidelines and links to articles about skin sensitivity. It signed off with a cryptic message, "The truth will surface." Karen had declared war. I closed the laptop and looked out at the pool. The water was calm again, blue only where it should be, but the surface no longer felt still. It felt like glass covering something unstable, something that had not yet finished rising. I knew she would not stop. I knew the video, however viral, was not the final word. Karen was not just angry, she was humiliated, and she would not let that humiliation end without a response. Somewhere in her house, a plan was forming. I could feel it, and I had no doubt that when it came, it would be louder than anything I had yet seen. It began subtly at first. Little things. A garbage bag that had been torn open at the end of my driveway, its contents spilling out like guts from a carcass. A low, rhythmic humming noise that started up around midnight and seemed to come from Karen's side of the fence, some kind of machine pressed against the boards with the intention of keeping me awake. Lawn clippings dumped neatly in the space between our properties. Small infractions, nothing that could be pinned to her directly, but all of them carrying her signature, petty, persistent, and just irritating enough to be impossible to ignore. I said nothing. I documented everything. I took photos. I time-stamped recordings. I began saving the security footage in labeled folders, dated and catalogued. I knew Karen was trying to bait me. She wanted a reaction she could manipulate, something she could twist into further claims of harassment. She wanted the tide of public opinion to shift, to make herself the victim again. But I refused to give her that satisfaction. That didn't stop her from escalating. About a week after she returned to public life, she launched her campaign. I came home to find a flyer tucked into my mailbox, one of dozens that had been distributed up and down the block. It was printed on thick, glossy paper and featured a header in bold red letters, Community Safety Alert. Below that was a blurry, zoomed-in screenshot of my pool taken from what appeared to be a ladder view over the fence, likely from her second-story window. The image was dark, grainy, but the words that followed left no room for interpretation. This residence has been observed utilizing hazardous dye compounds in recreational water systems. Said chemicals pose potential risks to wildlife, children, and household pets. Residents are advised to exercise caution and reconsider proximity to the affected property. It was laughable, except it wasn't. Not when you lived in a neighborhood that treated unapproved bird feeders like acts of rebellion. Not when the words hazardous and children appeared in the same sentence. Not when Karen had lived here longer than anyone and still wielded influence like a weathered sword. I collected 3 copies of the flyer and photographed each one. Then I took a walk. People met me with guarded expressions. No one accused me directly, but the undercurrent was there. The sense that maybe I had gone too far, that maybe turning Karen blue had been a stunt instead of a warning. I explained the dye again. Non-toxic, biodegradable, used in commercial resorts and amusement parks, harmless, unless you were the kind of person who liked sneaking into private yards after dark. Some nodded, some didn't. No one said much. Karen's petition followed the flyers. She went door to door, clipboard in hand, Captain trotting behind her like a furry, trembling assistant. She asked neighbors to sign a request demanding an HOA meeting to address the introduction of chemical deterrents on private property. I know this because I received a copy from one of the few neighbors I still trusted. He didn't sign, but he let her give the full pitch before declining. According to him, she used words like toxic exposure, escalation, and chemical profiling. He laughed when he told me this, but I didn't. It was all carefully worded, just vague enough to sow fear and just dramatic enough to attract attention. She didn't need to convince everyone, just enough people to stir discomfort, to make me feel unwelcome in my own space. Then came the vandalism. The first time it happened, I thought it was random. A loose brick through the back fence, splintered wood scattered along the walkway. I patched it up, checked the footage, but found nothing. A few days later, someone spray-painted the word toxic across the alley wall behind my garage. Bright green, sloppy lettering. Again, no clear culprit. Karen's house was quiet every time something happened. Too quiet. Not even Captain made a sound. I began to understand this was not just about revenge anymore. This was performance. Karen was crafting a story, one where she was the concerned citizen living beside an unstable neighbor. She wanted to reframe the narrative. I had gone viral. She wanted her piece of the spotlight too, and she didn't care how much she had to bend reality to get it. The climax came during the town hall meeting. It was held in the community center, a squat building with faded murals and an aging American flag that hung motionless in the stale indoor air. Karen arrived early. I arrived late, intentionally. I did not want to give her the satisfaction of watching me prepare. When I entered, she was already speaking, not shouting but commanding the room with the tone of someone used to being listened to. Her voice was syrupy and pained, her gestures practiced. She recounted the event with dramatic pauses, peppering her story with words like horrified and blindsided. She claimed she had been conducting a wellness check on my property after hearing strange noises. She described how she fell into the pool by accident. She did not mention the multiple camera angles that showed her climbing through a gate and stepping deliberately into the water. Some people nodded as she spoke. Others crossed their arms. A few stared at the floor. I waited until she finished before I spoke. I stood calmly. I explained the dye again. I referenced the footage. I stated the facts, avoided speculation. I reminded everyone that the pool was on private property, that Karen had not been invited, and that the dye had been implemented only after repeated signs of trespassing. When I finished, Karen rose from her chair. She did not yell, but her voice took on a sharpness that had been missing earlier. "This is not about rules," she said, eyes locked on mine. "This is about community. We are being poisoned by selfishness, by a need for attention, by people who think surveillance is a replacement for responsibility." Someone clapped, then quickly stopped. The moderator called for order and moved the meeting forward. No votes were cast, no decisions made, but I could feel the split in the room as people left. Some avoided my gaze, others nodded in support. Karen stood near the exit, shaking hands with anyone who passed. As I walked back to my car, I felt something shift inside me. Not fear, not anger, something harder. The realization that she was not going to stop until she had something to show for her shame. The neighborhood had become her battleground, and she would not leave it without a final blow. I unlocked the car and glanced back once more at the town hall. Karen was still standing there, watching me. She smiled, and I knew then that this was not over. She had more to reveal, and whatever it was, it would not come quietly. It took a week before I noticed the change in tone. The public response to the incident had started with humor, swelled into fascination, then darkened into mockery. That part had felt inevitable. What I did not expect was the shift in Karen's strategy. She was no longer trying to control the narrative. She was trying to rewrite it entirely, and people were beginning to listen. It started online. A single post from an anonymous account, one of those faceless usernames that always seem to appear at the first whiff of controversy. It claimed that the pool dye was not just cosmetic. According to this post, it was a government-designed compound originally developed for crowd control, re-engineered for use in experimental surveillance systems. The theory spiraled from there. The pool was not just a private installation, but a testing site. I was not a homeowner. I was a contractor. The dye did not stain skin. It tagged DNA. It embedded itself in the bloodstream. It could be tracked from satellites. It was absurd, but it spread. Other accounts jumped in. Videos appeared with robotic narration and ominous music, presenting collages of headlines, grainy photos of the pool, and long-winded voiceovers that drew meaningless connections between water filtration patents and obscure defense contracts. Someone even posted a fabricated document that claimed my property had once belonged to a government scientist. Another user zoomed in on one of my old vacation photos, pointing out a barely visible badge clipped to my backpack and claiming it proved I had military clearance. At first I laughed, then I stopped laughing. The conspiracies grew more detailed. A group formed under the name the Blue Pool Watch. They had a website, a mission statement, forum threads. They began organizing under hashtags, demanding that the truth be revealed. I was accused of everything from chemical warfare to psychological testing. Some wanted me arrested. Others demanded I release the formula for the dye. One video had over 1 million views and used voiceover footage of Karen's original meltdown as proof of emotional distress caused by secret experiments. It would have been funny if it had stayed online, but then people started showing up. The first came on a Tuesday morning. A young man parked his car just outside the neighborhood, walked past 3 houses, and set up a tripod across from my driveway. He held a microphone, spoke directly to the camera, and gestured toward the fence with theatrical flair. I watched him from behind the curtain. His video was uploaded before he even left the street. The next day, a pair of women arrived wearing matching shirts that read, "Die Another Day." They rang the bell, stood back, and waited. I did not answer. They left a pamphlet on my porch, detailing their concerns about neurological damage from synthetic pigments. After that, it escalated quickly. A dozen people appeared on a Saturday, armed with signs and bullhorns. They marched up and down the sidewalk in front of my house, chanting slogans like "No more chemicals in our pools" and "Expose the Stain" campaign. Karen was not among them, at least not visibly, but I recognized 2 of her newer acquaintances from the HOA meeting. It was clear they were connected. I called the police, not to shut it down, but to document it. An officer came by, watched the protest from his car, and finally stepped out to speak with me. He was polite, apologetic, and clearly baffled. I explained the situation again, this time including the conspiracy theories. He raised his eyebrows when I mentioned the fake government ties, then sighed and said, "You know, people will believe anything if you film it right." Later that evening, someone broke into the backyard. I did not hear them, but the cameras caught everything. A man in a black hoodie, gloves, and a ski mask. He scaled the fence, crouched near the pool filter, and pried open the access panel. He rummaged inside for a few minutes, removed something I could not identify, and fled the way he came. It happened just after midnight. I found the damage the next morning. The lock was snapped, a pipe had been cracked, a screwdriver lay abandoned in the grass. I reviewed the footage frame by frame and sent it to the police, but without a clear view of the intruder's face, there was little they could do. They filed another report. I replaced the lock. The next afternoon, one of the protesters from the weekend returned alone. She knocked, and this time, I opened the door. She was older than I expected, maybe late 50s, with sharp eyes and a confident posture. She introduced herself only by first name and said she was with a local safety initiative. I told her I was not interested. She stepped back but continued speaking. "We just want transparency," she said. "People deserve to know what's in their environment." I asked her if she had spoken to Karen. She smiled slightly, then said, "Karen is a whistleblower. You should take her seriously." Before I could respond, she turned and walked back to her car. I stood there for a moment, letting the door swing half-closed in the summer breeze, wondering just how far this was going to go. That night, I checked the online forums again. A new thread had appeared, claiming a second person had turned blue. This time, it was one of Karen's supporters, a man named Paul who lived a few blocks over. He had apparently dipped his hand in the pool while trying to collect water for testing and had ended up with stained fingers. The thread included photos of his hand, splotched in uneven patches of color. The accompanying caption read, "Proof of harmful exposure." I knew Paul. He had stood near the back of the HOA meeting, nodding along with everything Karen said. I remembered the way he avoided eye contact with me afterward. He had clearly gone snooping, and now he was using his stained fingers as evidence of contamination. It was not going to stop. The dye had done what it was supposed to do. It had exposed a trespasser. But in doing so, it had also exposed something else, something festering in the cracks between politeness and paranoia. Karen had weaponized her embarrassment and given it structure, and now it was growing. I shut the laptop and stared at the screen's reflection in the window. Outside, the streetlights buzzed quietly. The pool shimmered under a cloudless sky. Somewhere out there, people were building entire narratives out of shadows. And Karen was still at the center of all of it, unseen but unmistakably present. Her silence was no longer retreat. It was strategy. I had underestimated her again, and this time, I might not be able to keep the story mine. It was a few days after the supposed second blue staining incident when the sabotage began in earnest. Until then, everything had taken place on the surface. Protest signs, conspiracies, accusations wrapped in politeness, and neighborly visits soaked in passive aggression. But that boundary cracked the morning I found the wiring to the security camera at the back corner of the yard completely severed. Not frayed, not chewed, cleanly cut. I examined the damage in silence. The cable hung limp against the fence, the copper filaments exposed like nerves. The camera housing had been unscrewed and left dangling by a single bolt. There were no other signs of disturbance, no footprints in the dirt, no obvious points of entry. Whoever had done it knew how to move without leaving a trace. That, in itself, was a message. This was no longer someone reacting to embarrassment. This was precision, intent. Someone had decided it was time to escalate. I replaced the wire the same day. Then I rewired the panel with a backup battery, changed the mounting location, and adjusted the camera angles to better capture the blind spots. The footage would now upload in real time to a remote server. I was not waiting for another surprise. That evening, I received an anonymous text message from a number I did not recognize. It said only 3 words: "Shut it down." No punctuation, no name, no explanation. I stared at the message for a long time, my mind shuffling through possibilities. It could have been a prank. It could have been a bluff. Or it could have been something more deliberate. A warning, maybe. Or a threat. The next day, Karen returned. It was just before dusk. The sky still held the last traces of orange and purple, and the street was quiet in that way it gets when the day has begun to fold in on itself. I was in the kitchen when I heard the metallic creak of the side gate opening, followed by the soft click of footsteps on stone. I did not move right away. I let the cameras do their work. From the monitor, I watched her figure pass along the perimeter of the pool, her posture tight, her head jerking from side to side as she scanned for any signs of surveillance. She wore dark clothes and carried what looked like a backpack. Captain was not with her. She reached the filter panel and crouched. I could not see exactly what she was doing, but I saw her pull something from the bag and wedge it into the wiring panel, moving quickly, hands steady. Then she stood and took a few cautious steps toward the pool. She knelt by the edge, dipped something metallic into the water, and held it there. A small cylindrical probe, maybe. I watched her pull it out and shake it once, checking the result. That is when the alarm triggered. Not the soft ping I usually received for motion. This was the loud one, the one reserved for full breach events. A siren rang from the camera hub. The lights on the deck flared on. Karen froze. Her shoulders rose, and she turned her head sharply toward the house. Then, in one abrupt motion, she lunged toward the opposite side of the yard and disappeared behind the hedges. I rushed outside, flashlight in hand, heart beating loud enough to feel in my fingertips. The air was heavy and full of the distant whine of insects. I ran to the spot where she had vanished and followed the bend in the fence. There was no sign of her. Only the filter panel stood open, a tangle of wires and tools scattered like the contents of a burglar's kit. But it was not what she left near the filter that caught my attention. It was what she left buried. The edge of a metal case stuck out from beneath the mulch near the tool shed. I might not have noticed it if not for the beam of the flashlight catching the corner, dull silver against the damp soil. I knelt, brushed away the dirt, and pulled it loose. The box was small but heavy, sealed with 2 latches and a faded serial number stamped across the top. There were no markings beyond that. I carried it inside and set it on the kitchen counter. My hands were trembling slightly, though I tried to convince myself it was just adrenaline. I examined the latches, then hesitated. I had no idea what was inside. It could have been anything. A prop, a hoax, a plant, but the weight of it felt real. I undid the latches and opened the lid. Inside was a hard drive, thick and grey with a scratched plastic casing. Next to it sat a laminated folder containing diagrams, blueprints, and notes in faded ink. Most of the pages were technical, full of circuitry and acronyms I did not immediately recognize. But one page near the back stood out. It was a letter, typed, addressed to someone named Walter. The letter spoke of a prototype, an experimental pool system designed for covert identification of intruders. Not just dye, but a layered system of reactive agents triggered by specific biometric markers. It referenced tests conducted in private locations, names redacted, results inconsistent. It warned of incomplete deactivation protocols. It was signed with initials, not a name. At the bottom, in handwriting, someone had scrawled, "Do not install without full shielding." My stomach dropped. I thought back to the dye, to how easily I had accepted Marcus's word when he told me it was harmless, how I had trusted that it was just a visual deterrent, nothing more. I never asked what else it might contain. I never asked if it was unfinished. I stared at the open case and felt a coldness settle into my spine. If Karen had found this, even partially, then her theory was not entirely fabricated. Maybe she had taken a half-truth and blown it into hysteria, but that half-truth now sat on my counter, very real, very physical, and very far outside what I thought I had agreed to use. I turned to the security feed. The footage showed Karen retreating through the yard, hands empty, face taut with panic. She had not expected the alarm. She had not expected to be caught again. But she had been searching for something, and she had almost found it. I locked the box in the basement storage closet and bolted the door. The next morning, the power went out. Not just in my house, but across the entire block. A rolling blackout that cut through everything with surgical timing. I checked the grid. There had been no scheduled maintenance, no notice. The entire neighborhood fell into silence, The usual buzz of machines replaced by the chirp of birds and the muffled confusion of people stepping out into the street, unsure of what had happened. I checked the pool first. The filter system had shut down. The cameras were still on, battery-powered, but the network was down. The sensors were off. Everything designed to protect the property had gone dark at the same time. And that was when I knew. Karen had triggered something she did not understand. She had forced the system into a state it was never meant to enter. The die was just the beginning. The box was not meant to be found. And now, something was loose that I no longer had full control over. I stood at the edge of the pool and stared into the still water. It looked the same, but I no longer believed that it was. By the time the sun crept fully over the rooftops, painting Oak Grove Lane in its usual soft gold, I had already been awake for hours. I had stood beside the pool since dawn, watching the surface for signs of change. The water shimmered, flat and unassuming, but it felt different. It felt watched. Even the birds were quieter than usual. The power outage had ended sometime around 4 in the morning, flickering back to life with a sequence of mechanical clicks and gentle whirs as systems restarted. Lights blinked on, the cameras rebooted, and the filter resumed its steady hum. But something about the way the power had vanished and returned left a sense of unease, like a dream that refuses to dissolve after waking. I reviewed the footage once the network was restored, but the blackout had wiped several hours clean. All feeds had gone dark at the same time, and not a single frame remained between midnight and 3:42. The absence itself was suspicious. Systems like mine had battery backups, redundancies, and timed local saves. Even in an outage, there should have been fragments, but what I saw was pure black. As if someone had not just cut the power, but reached into the machine and stripped the memory out, like a thief yanking film from a reel. I turned my attention back to the metal box still hidden in the basement storage. I had not opened it since the night I found it, but I kept thinking about the letter. About the way it described the pool system not as a finished product, but as a prototype. The diagrams had not been labeled with typical engineering precision. They had been littered with notes in shorthand, scribbles in margins, arrows drawn in ink that had faded with time. Whoever had worked on this had been in a rush, or working alone, or maybe just trying to capture something no one else was meant to understand. Marcus had told me the die was harmless. He had said it was designed to deter, not to alter. But Marcus had also spoken casually, as if the project he referred to was common knowledge, something already tested and approved. I began to wonder if even he had known the full truth, or if he had simply passed along something he barely understood. I called him. The line rang 7 times before going to voicemail. I waited half an hour and tried again. Still nothing. I sent a message, brief and direct. Did you know it was unfinished? No reply. That same day, a dark sedan appeared across the street. It parked without ceremony, facing the house at an angle that made it look like it belonged, though I had never seen it before. 2 men remained inside, both wearing sunglasses and speaking to no one. They stayed there for almost an hour, then drove off. I did not recognize them, but their silence spoke volumes. Karen, however, did not stay silent. She emerged from her house around 10, dressed in her signature tennis whites, her skin pale again, save for a faint discoloration at the edges of her wrists. The blue had faded, but not completely. She carried a folder and a tablet, and walked with the confidence of someone who believed herself to be winning. She made a beeline for the edge of my property, and called out without stepping past the gate. "You need to come clean," she said, her voice carrying across the yard. "This is beyond you now." I stepped onto the deck, met her eyes, and waited. "There are people watching," she continued. "You think this is about Di, but it's not. This is bigger. You've stumbled into something you don't understand." I said nothing. I wanted her to speak freely. She always revealed more when she thought no one was going to stop her. "Someone reached out to me," she said, holding up the folder. "Not the media, not the neighborhood council. Real people, ones who care about what's being covered up here." I almost laughed. She said it like she had been summoned into some elite circle of knowledge. In reality, she had likely been contacted by the same fringe forums and conspiracy circles that had begun circling my name like vultures. But she believed it. She believed she was now part of something righteous. "You've been compromised," she added. And if you won't come forward with the truth, others will. I walked down the steps slowly and approached the fence. She flinched but held her ground. There is no conspiracy, I said quietly. You trespassed, you got caught, and now you're trying to rewrite the ending. She smirked, stepped closer, and leaned just slightly across the boundary. You don't get to decide how this ends, she whispered. Later that afternoon I received a letter. Not an email, not a phone call. A physical envelope, hand-delivered, no postage. It had no return address. Inside was a printed form, stamped with an emblem I did not recognize. It read like a legal warning, full of vague language about property modification and unauthorized technology use. At the bottom was a signature made only of initials. I took it inside and placed it next to the metal case. For a long time I stared at both, trying to understand how everything had spiraled so far. A month ago, I had wanted a quiet summer. A few peaceful afternoons, a little privacy. Now I was sitting on top of something that felt more like an undiscovered fault line, and the tremors were growing stronger. That night, I returned to the pool with a flashlight and a crowbar. I removed the stones lining the far edge, pried open the old maintenance hatch, and began digging. I had not planned to. I had not even known exactly what I was looking for, but some part of me could not let the unanswered questions go. If there was more hidden beneath the surface, I needed to find it. It took an hour to uncover the second box. This one was deeper, buried in concrete, smaller than the first but heavier. It had no markings at all, just a single recessed handle and a rusted lock. I broke the lock and opened it slowly. Inside was a glass vial. It sat nestled in foam, glowing faintly in the darkness like a firefly trapped in a bottle. It pulsed with a rhythm I could not explain. Next to it was a note, sealed in plastic. I peeled it open. Use only in closed systems, not stable above ground. Do not combine with activated dye. There were more instructions, technical and rushed. The kind of warnings that sounded like they had been written in a panic. The vial hummed faintly in my hand. I resealed the box, lowered it back into the ground, and covered it with the stones. As I stood over the place where I had found it, I understood something with chilling clarity. The dye was never the danger. It was only the switch. And something else had been buried here long before I ever moved in. Whatever my uncle had been working on, whatever Marcus had passed along, whatever Karen had almost uncovered, it was still live. And now that the system had been triggered, I did not know what would happen next. The neighborhood never went back to what it had been before. Even after the protests quieted and the conspiracies started to burn themselves out, Oak Grove Lane carried a tension that hummed beneath every ordinary sound. The lawnmowers seemed louder. The sprinkler systems hissed with more insistence. Conversations between neighbors became brief, clipped, and eyes rarely lingered in one place too long. Everyone knew something had happened, something real and strange, and now they were pretending not to care. But you could feel it, like heat rising from pavement. Karen never apologized. Of course, no one expected her to. She vanished for a few days after our final conversation at the fence. Her car stayed in the driveway. The curtains stayed drawn. Then she emerged one afternoon in a crisp white blouse, no trace of blue left on her skin, and marched down the street with a clipboard and a fresh stack of forms. She was back on a mission, though this one was quieter, subtler, as if she had been given new instructions or had finally realized that overt noise would no longer work. I watched her for a few days, saw her approach houses, saw people answer their doors with expressions of curiosity or wariness. I never saw her stay long. Maybe she was collecting signatures again. Maybe she was handing out warnings. Whatever she was doing, she avoided my house entirely. Not once did she make eye contact when I stood outside. Not once did she walk her dog past the front gate. It was like a treaty had been signed without words, and part of its terms included a complete ceasefire. I kept the pool closed for the rest of the summer. I drained it, ran the filters dry, covered the surface with a reinforced tarp, and posted signs that warned of maintenance work in progress. A few neighbors asked if everything was all right. I told them I was reconfiguring the system. That was not a lie. It just was not the full truth. The metal boxes were still buried. I had sealed both with concrete and gravel, reinforced the hatch, and disabled the wiring that led to their original ports. The second box, the one with the vial, had never been opened again. I stored the plastic-covered instructions in a safe inside my house. I read them only once, late at night, and then put them away with the same reverence someone might give to a loaded weapon. I had considered contacting someone official, but I never made the call. It was not fear that stopped me. It was something else, something more stubborn. If this thing was meant to be hidden, if it had been buried and forgotten, then digging it up was not going to make things better. I did not trust anyone enough to take it away. I had already seen what happened when just a piece of it touched the world. I was not ready to let the rest out. A few weeks later, a pair of men in dark suits arrived. They did not knock. They did not come up the path. They stood on the sidewalk across the street for 5 minutes, looked at the house, made a note on a clipboard, and left. Their car did not have plates. I told myself it was nothing, a coincidence. But I stayed up that night checking the locks again. One morning in early September, I received a letter. This one had no address, no sender, just my name typed in neat block letters across the front. Inside was a single page. Printed in red ink, it said, "Status, contained, observation, concluded, reassignment pending." That was it. No instructions, no threats. Just a quiet acknowledgement, like a seal had been placed over the story, and someone, somewhere, had decided it was time to move on. Karen changed too. Not drastically, not in a way that most people would notice, but I could see it. She no longer lingered at the edge of her yard. She no longer marched through the neighborhood with the same sharp confidence. She still organized, still hosted meetings in her driveway, still wore that same tailored authority like armor, but something in her eyes had dimmed. She looked over her shoulder more often. She answered questions with shorter replies. And when someone laughed too loudly near her house, she turned her head just slightly, like she was bracing for something. I never spoke to her again. Not directly. She left me alone, and I returned the favor. We existed in a kind of uneasy symmetry. Two people who had seen behind the curtain and now had to pretend it was still intact. The others in the neighborhood went on pretending too. They mowed their lawns, painted their fences, hosted birthday parties with pink balloons and folding chairs. But the memory of the blue had settled into the soil. Everyone remembered, even if they pretended not to. I released one final video. It was not a follow-up or a sequel. There was no attempt at drama or shock. Just a short clip, a quiet narration, a few minutes of reflection. I showed the empty pool, the drained shell, the quiet yard. I told the story again, this time without music or edits, just the facts as they had happened. I ended the video with a pause, then said, "Sometimes the warning is the lesson." The video did well, but I disabled comments. I did not want a conversation. I only wanted it to be heard. Later that fall, I received an envelope from Marcus. No return address, just a small card inside. It said, "You did what I couldn't. Thank you." I tried to call him again. His number was disconnected. Winter came early that year. By December, the pool was hidden under a thin layer of snow. The hedges froze in place, and the fence creaked in the wind. Karen strung lights along her porch, blue ones. I could not tell if that was intentional or not. I left mine off. In the spring, the HOA sent out a newsletter. It included a new rule banning any chemical-based deterrents or unapproved water additives in backyard pools. I read it twice, smiled, and folded it away. I never uncovered the boxes. I never touched the system again. It remained there, under the concrete, under the soil, dormant but not forgotten. Maybe one day someone else would find it. Maybe someone already had. But if they did, I hoped they would read the notes carefully. I hoped they would understand what I had come to understand. This was not a story about revenge. It was not about exposure or shame or even justice. It was about boundaries, about what happens when someone crosses them and what must sometimes rise to meet them. The pool had been quiet ever since, but I knew better than to believe it was truly still.